welcome to the morning after the night before. I'm Dave Morris here in the Oklahoman's video studio. Last night, the nation watched as Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton debated their second presidential debate before next month's general election for the president. Joining us for a recap and to talk about the Oklahoma angle of this from Washington, D.C. is Chris Casteel. How are you this morning, sir?
Hey, Dave. I'm doing fine.
Good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. Last night, I was driving back from Missouri, so I didn't see the debate. I listened to it on the radio, and it's an interesting perspective to hear the candidates talk and to hear the moderators try to wrangle these two candidates versus seeing it on TV. Then later on, I saw some clips on TV, and of course, then you see the facial expressions. You see Donald Trump wandering around in the background behind Hillary Clinton. It's just different listening to it on the radio from seeing it on TV. Which leads us to, over the weekend, on Friday, NBC, some tapes that they had released by the Washington Post of Donald Trump and some innuendos, let's say, that were on that tape, led to a whole bunch of headlines and storylines over the weekend leading into this debate. And you were working over the weekend to try to get reaction from the Oklahoma delegation to comments that Trump had made back in 2005. So while you're watching the debate last night, you get a statement from Oklahoma Governor Mary Fallin.
That's correct. Yeah, I started working on trying to get reaction from Fallin and mainly the congressional delegation, the senators and the 5 U.S. House members, all Republican. As soon as the story broke Friday afternoon, I haven't put them in the position of trying to respond to everything Trump says or does. It would be nonstop. They're not jukeboxes. You don't just put in a quarter and get a quote. But I thought they probably should respond to. It was obvious this was going to just totally blow up. So I got something from Inhofe pretty quick, which was, I don't want to get into their personal lives. And then late Friday night, probably around 11 o'clock Eastern or so, I think I got something from James Langford basically saying this, these comments are disgusting, but in no way suggesting that he wasn't going to support Trump anymore. I think reiterating his position that he wants a Republican to put Supreme Court justices on put conservatives on the Supreme Court. Fallin has been the biggest booster of Trump in the state, by far. Really, as far as high-profile people, silence. She was one of the. I think she was probably the first person I contacted. Her press person, Michael McNutt, former reporter for the Oklahoman, and he said, "Well, she's in meetings. I'll see. I don't know. It could be tough." And then later, I just, as we're getting close to deadline Friday night, I emailed him back and said, "Look, am I going to get something tonight?" Silence, nothing. Didn't hear from him again until the middle of the debate last night. That's when they dropped Fallin's statement.
And Chris, I'll interrupt you right here because we saw over the weekend the governor was down in Dallas for the OU Texas football game. This story is still boiling. We're right in the Bible Belt here in Oklahoma City. I was having a discussion. I was out of town this weekend, but part of the conversation we had was morality plays a big part in Oklahoma politics, if you will. People bring in the Bible, and of course Senator Langford probably had that in his statement as well. Were you surprised that you didn't hear back from the governor sooner?
Let me say, I have to kind of just separate the governor from the members of the congressional delegation, who I deal with on a regular basis, obviously, but on the delegation, I'm not totally surprised. These are guys, they can mobilize a press release in an hour on transgender bathrooms. And that's not an exaggeration. And, and they did. Within, the afternoon, they put out a joint press release the day that this whole transgender bathroom issue, blew up because of the Department of Education guidance. And I think all of them started writing columns about it. We heard immediately what they thought about the idea of, a transgender student using the bathroom of his or her choice. Couldn't hear enough of it, actually. But I have sensed for a long time, a year, that these guys, as loquacious as they can be, do not want to talk about Donald Trump. And and it's not like any members of the delegation have come out really strongly for him. They've not been huge supporters of Trump. They have given some of the the most lame kind of endorsements, if you want to call them that, of Donald Trump. Well, I'm sure not voting for Hillary, that kind of stuff. But what I sense is that they're afraid to talk about it because they just get inundated, by Trump supporters back there, maybe even nationwide, because these comments can get out on the internet if they're going to say something critical about Trump, and you just have this whole wave of Trump people, badgering their staffs is really what it comes down to. It's not like the congressmen sit in their offices and pick up the phone, or check. I don't know if they check their Facebook pages. I assume some of them don't even know what a Facebook page is, really. But it's their staffs. And I just kind of think they're afraid of Trump people, really. I mean, like I said, they'll take on transgender students, but Trump people are, kind of a whole different category for them. Now, Fallon, I don't deal with a whole lot, in terms of trying to get comments from her, but I was surprised that it took her that long to respond. You had lawmakers all over the country and governors all over the country, Republicans, that on Friday and Saturdays. I mean, how long do you need to study that tape, really?
To the point that Trump has said, well, with the Billy Bush hot mic situation, or live on the air of Howard Stern, two things. Number one, why are these just now bubbling to the surface? Where have these been throughout the campaign? And number two, there's been enough of these things along the way that honestly it's not that surprising that, well, here we go again.
Yeah, I don't know about the why this is just coming out. I mean, that is a good question. I think NBC has to probably answer for that, and I don't know how the Washington Post reporter got them. Obviously, they're NBC. They were the property of NBC, I believe, and from suggestions that have been out there this weekend, there may be some similar comments from tapings of The Apprentice, the reality show that Donald Trump had for many years before this. So I'm not really sure about any of that. I think I pulled up a story this morning, and it's not totally analogous in that I pulled up the story from when the Ken Starr report came out about Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky. And this isn't like the newspaper stories, but the actual report, where the special prosecutor had gone in and interviewed everybody involved, and this is what led to the impeachment. But I was sitting in an Oklahoma congressman's office at the time when the report came out, as he was reading it for the very first time. And then I think I went, from reading the story again, I must have gone up around the hill to all the other offices, because I caught some of the other ones, and they didn't hesitate to comment on that. And that's a different situation. Bill Clinton was president of the United States. This happened in the Oval Office, and this was also wrapped up in the question of whether he was lying. So, I think, there are different dynamics there about whether the delegation was going to comment immediately about it or not, because that had been percolating for a while. But what is obvious about the tape that came out on Friday is that it is Donald Trump. Those are his comments. He never denied making them over the weekend. He expressed some contrition, arguably, about it. But so I think that the delegation, if they wanted to, as many members of Congress did, could just give some kind of reaction to that. Is this a guy? Is this a person? Is this a man they want to be in the Oval Office? Is that, and if they do believe he's still qualified to be president of the United States, I mean, have they forever kind of forfeited their I don't want to say right, but I mean, do they forfeit from then on the ability to ever judge an elected official's character? I mean, you can't, if you're going to do this because of your party, not criticize Donald Trump, and let's not act like we wouldn't have heard from these guys if this was a Democrat. Do you ever get to say anything about character again in public life? I mean, if you can't, just immediately denounce what he said about women, what do you get to say? And these are guys who don't, some of whom don't hesitate to moralize.
We're talking with Chris Casteel. He's joining us from our studio in Washington, D.C. at the Washington Examiner. We always appreciate catching up with him every week. Typically, we do it on a Wednesday afternoon. Today we're doing it on Monday morning following last night's debate. The next debate and final debate will be Wednesday, October 19th. Fittingly enough, I think, in Las Vegas. One of the topics last night for the candidates to address was Donald Trump's 20-year-old tax return showing a loss of $916 million, which has raised some questions about the tax code and tax returns. Chris dove into this topic from a local angle. You can find that in Sunday's editions of the Oklahoman. It's also available on newsok.com. And there's a ton of interesting nuggets in this story. Talking about in 2014 in Oklahoma, taxpayers claimed $10 billion worth of deductions, 2/3 taken by those with adjusted gross incomes of $100,000 or more, according to the IRS. You really show a lot of detail and information kind of explaining the breakdown of Oklahoma tax returns and what it means.
Yeah, and I've done this story, I think, maybe 3 or 4 times previously. I usually do it kind of every other year, looking at the IRS statistics about each state. They put them out for each state, and they're very detailed. They're very interesting, if you like numbers at all, because it's all numbers.
Well, and speaking of those numbers, let's just break it down for people. As you noted here, in 2014 in Oklahoma, people making more than $100,000 comprised just 14% of those who filed a federal tax return, but they paid 75% of the federal income taxes owed in the state.
Right, and that's, I don't know that people realize that it is that heavily weighted towards higher income people in the federal tax income burden. And, we should say, right off the top that there, as most people know, if you ever looked at their paycheck, there's federal withholding, that's your income tax. And that pays for pretty much, everything that's not Medicare and Social Security. I mean, it pays for the military, it pays for education, it pays for farm subsidies, it pays for a whole range of government activity. Then you have 2 other deductions from your paycheck that are federal: Social Security, FICA, whatever is how it's written on your paycheck, and Medicare, and those are separate. So, and everybody pays those. There's no $916 million business loss that's going to get you out of paying Medicare and Social Security in a given year. So what I'm dealing with in this story is federal income tax. And it is heavily weighted toward the people who pay it are high income people. There's a lot, I think, some people might remember the quote 47% that Mitt Romney talked about that really got him in trouble in the 2012
That's right. That was the tape that came back and ultimately kind of bit him.
And he's talking about people who don't pay income taxes, and there's this I think kind of I don't want to say misperception, but let's just say for people who are very low income, pay no income tax, and some people actually even get a big check back. Not in a tax refund, but what's called the earned income tax credit. I don't know if I didn't get into that this time, which I've done in the past, but if you make, below a certain amount, but it's income, if you're a working person and you've got a family and you make below a certain amount, you're not going to pay any income tax. You actually might get, $3,000-$4,000 refunded to you, which a lot of people believe is kind of a refund for the payroll taxes they pay, the Medicare and Social Security, even though they wouldn't come close to paying that much. But really, I mean, the bottom line here is what you said, that 75% of the income tax in Oklahoma in 2014 was paid by 14% of the people who filed a tax return. And a heck of a lot of people who filed one owed nothing. And, there are some, you can't really get into like a specific business, like a Donald Trump type, like a real estate business, to see who wrote off huge losses and why. There's not granular information like that, but a heck of a lot of partnerships and these other business arrangements that file in the individual tax code did claim losses, big losses, because they had negative, they paid less than $1 in income tax, may have even gotten these kinds of write-offs in a percentage basis that we're talking about. A lot of farmers, I think my story said close to 5,000 farms claimed less than $1 of income. So there are a lot of ways to evade taxes, and I shouldn't use that word evade, because we all use deductions. If you don't itemize them, if you don't have like a home mortgage and charitable donations that you itemize separately. If you just take the standard deduction, that's still $6,000 in deductions you're taking, and I assume everybody does it. So whether Donald Trump paid federal income taxes or not, that might be kind of a different debate. I think that there's I don't really know how to judge this debate about whether you should pay federal what if it's some kind of crime not to pay federal income taxes if you're going by the tax code. Like I said, everybody does it, and it wouldn't make any sense not to do it, really. If you've got $12,000 in home mortgage interest, are you not going to deduct that? And is that not going to lower your tax burden? Is there some level of taxes that Donald Trump should have paid? I don't know. What would it be? How much should he have paid?
You spoke with U.S. Representative Tom Cole in this story. I'll point out two more interesting things. He told you the top 1% in Oklahoma pay 38% of the federal.
That's nationally.
That's national.
That's national. Yeah.
So the national quota is the top 1% pay 38% of federal income taxes. The bottom 50% pay about 4% of income taxes. You also looked.
So anyway, the point being, and I'm sorry to interrupt, I was rambling like that, is like, despite all these deductions that the wealthy take, and a lot of them are only available to the wealthier people, because there's no sense in actually claiming deductions as an individual unless it's over a certain threshold, which is $6,000. I think in 2014 it was the standard deduction was $6,020. So it's only if you have deductions above that you're even going to itemize. So really it's available to only people who would have more than that in deductions. But even though they did, I think my story said like $2 billion, the people over $100,000 wrote off $2 billion in charitable contributions alone. Despite all those deductions, they still pay most of the taxes. And that's not, the most of the debate about tax reform really is about, how to close off some of these deductions. So I think the debate really is to how to make the wealthy pay more of taxes, and that's a policy thing, a policy decision that they're probably going to be fighting about in the next 2 years. That was part that came up kind of last night in the debate, not enough. They never really seem to get into the nitty-gritty of this stuff. They say the same old things that they've said a million times about tax reform or Obamacare, and it's all very superficial. Or I'm never enlightened at all by listening to them about what they would do about anything, really.
It does seem like a lot of times they'll start down a road and you're like, okay, this is something I haven't heard. We're actually going to hear some details, and then it's immediate segue into the same talking points on every one of these topics that we have heard over the last 6 months.
And to some extent, I understand, because it's hard to explain a lot of this tax stuff. But this is what they had. They pay millions of dollars to communications people for, right? Help us simplify this. Help us, explain this to the average voter out there. What does tax reform really mean? And don't be afraid to just say to the lower income people and lower middle class people, you really don't pay much in federal income tax. So I'm not going to act like you do. Let's actually start this debate from the facts. The facts are the wealthy pay most of it. So let's talk about what we're going to do, to get more of their income, because that's really what what tax reform would be about. They're not going to raise taxes on people who make less than $100,000. There's never any talk about doing that. So I don't even know if it's worth discussing so much, if you're just going to talk about, how to get more money out of the wealthy, because, that does get so granular that I think it's beyond most people's interest or appreciation. To start talking about carried interest, and investment income and that kind of thing. I don't really think people are that interested. But I do think, when they got into Obamacare last night, briefly, Trump goes on calling it a disaster and then starts talking about, it sounded to me like he was saying expanding Medicaid more, and I'm like, so how do you pay for that?
It's very interesting when you start to think, okay, what does that mean and where would that go? And yes, that was Trump's point that he mentioned several times, was carried interest. This story that we've been talking
about. Carried interest is basically how hedge fund people, it's basically about interest. It's investment income. And it's about how, investment income is not taxed at nearly the same rate as people's income at their jobs, their paychecks. Might be taxed depending on how much money you make. But again, they could get rid of that, and that's not exactly going to solve the deficit. And that's the other thing that I don't think is, exactly ever made crystal clear about any of this tax reform. This is not like, deficit changing kind of, amounts that they're talking about. It's, when they get into corporate tax reform, especially, which is, I think mainly what they want to tackle is more than individual. It's really what kind of changes can you make to kind of jumpstart the economy? Okay, what can you do in the tax code, to encourage more job creation? And there is this point about all this corporate money that's been parked overseas because the corporations like Apple or ExxonMobil, whoever they might be, don't want to bring it back and lose most of it to taxes.
Very good. We've been chatting with Chris Casteel from the Oklahoman. He's officed up in Washington, D.C. with the Washington Examiner. Chris, what's the rest of this week look like? What else are you working on?
Well, working on a really kind of interesting story that I'm sure people are going to roll their eyes about, but because there really aren't any interesting races, or very few interesting political races in Oklahoma this year, aside from the state questions, many of which are really interesting, but as far as, for elected office, there aren't any. But 2018 is going to be a huge election year back there. Almost every statewide office will be up for grabs, including governor, lieutenant governor, at least one congressional seat. So what I did last week, and I'm compiling them now, is I polled anonymously, and I let people answer anonymously so they could speak freely. Some of I would say the most plugged in political people in the state. What are you hearing? Who's running for governor? Who's running for lieutenant governor? Who's running for the first district? So I let them answer anonymously, and I've gotten some really fascinating answers about who might be looking at governor and Congress and that kind of thing in 2018, which, as one respondent said, will be a transformational year in Oklahoma politics. So I'm working on that this week. And again, I know people are so sick of 2016 that they don't want to look ahead to 2018, but it won't be long after the elections of 2016 that people will start announcing for 2018 and start running, really.
Always smart reporting from our Chris Casteel. You can follow his work in the Oklahoman and online at newsok.com. Sir, thanks for your time this morning.
Glad to do it.
You can also follow Chris on Twitter at NewsOK Politics.